October 17, 1884. The air at the mouth of the hollow mine was cold enough to make a ghost of her breath. Adeline Finch ran a gloved hand over the granite face, feeling the chill seep through the worn leather. The rock was alive with it, a deep and ancient cold that had nothing to do with the coming winter. In her other hand, she held the geology hammer. Its head was a small, squared-off block of steel, one side for chipping and the other a flat face for breaking. The hickory handle, dark from her husband Thomas's sweat and then her own, was worn to a perfect, silent smoothness. She tapped the rock, not hard, just a light percussion that sent a dull thud echoing into the darkness behind the stone. It was the sound of a question asked to something that did not speak in words. What nobody in the valley below knew, what the men with their legal papers and their thin smiles could never comprehend, was that this mountain had already spoken to her. It had told her its secrets through the man she had loved and buried. Thomas had read the strata-like pages in a book, and he had taught her the language of stone, of water, of patient and unending pressure. A world can end with a signature on a piece of paper. But another can begin with a single strike of a hammer. The man who came to take her farm was named Sterling Vance. He did not come with riders or threats, which would have been an honest kind of cruelty. He came alone, his city boots polished to a high shine despite the dust of the Pinyon Creek Road. He held the papers in a leather folio, and he explained the terms with a voice as smooth and cool as river water running over stones. The debt, he said, was a settled matter. The water rights, tied to her husband's name and not her own, were now the property of the Syndicate. It was all legal. It was all proper. He expressed his condolences for her loss, a perfect and hollow sentiment that hung in the air of the small cabin Thomas had built. Adeline looked past him, through the open door, to her neighbor Martha's cabin. She saw the curtain twitch and fall still. In that small movement, she felt the true nature of her isolation. The town had been promised a dam, prosperity, a future brought by Vance and his money. She was just a widow on a dry patch of land, an obstacle to be cleared away with regrettable but necessary paperwork. Vance offered her $100 for her trouble, for the fences and the barn and the 2 graves on the hill. Adeline looked at his clean fingernails, then down at her own, permanently grimed with the soil of the place she was to lose. She did not argue. She did not weep. "I will need 1 week," she said, her voice even. To gather my things, Vance smiled, a slight, satisfied tilting of his lips. He saw a woman folding. He saw surrender. He saw a problem neatly solved. He was a man who only understood the world written on paper, and so he could not imagine the world that was being planned in the silence behind her eyes. That night, the work began. There was no frantic packing, no desperate selling of possessions. Adeline moved with a quiet, methodical purpose that was its own form of prayer. First came the seeds. She took down the carefully labeled muslin sacks from the pantry, Blue Lake beans, bodacious corn, Rocky Ford melons, and the hardy mountain potatoes that grew even in stubborn soil. She wrapped them in oilcloth and placed them in a wooden crate. Then came the tools. Not the large plow or the harrow, which she could not move and would not need, but the small, essential things. The spade with the mended handle, the heavy-tined fork, the sharpest of her hoes, and an assortment of trowels and knives. And of course, the geology hammer, which she tucked into the belt of her work dress. She worked by the light of a single lantern, its flame casting long, dancing shadows on the cabin walls. Each object she chose was weighed not just in pounds, but in its potential to begin again. The iron kettle for boiling water. The heavy skillet. A small sack of salt, more precious than gold. The 2 quilts from her marriage bed, filled with thick wool. She was not packing to leave. She was provisioning an ark. Every trip she made from the cabin to the mouth of the hollow mine, a 1/4 mile up the rocky slope, was a deliberate act of defiance. She carried the crates and sacks on her back, her muscles straining in the cold, thin air. The moon was a sliver, offering just enough light to see the path her feet already knew by heart. She did not think of what she was losing. She thought only of what she was carrying forward. The life in the seeds, the strength in the iron, the memory in the quilts. She was not fleeing. She was transplanting the heart of her world from one place to another. The animals were the most difficult part. She had 2 goats, a nanny named Hester and her kid, Pearl. They were nimble and accustomed to the rocky terrain, but they were loud with their complaints. Adeline waited until the deepest point of the night, when the valley was sunk in a profound and dreamless sleep. She led them up the trail, murmuring to them, her hand stroking their coarse hair. She had already prepared a small, temporary pen just inside the mine's entrance, using rocks and a few boards she had carried up earlier. She gave them a small measure of feed and fresh water from her well, a final gift from the land she was leaving. Next came the chickens, a half-dozen hens who roosted in the small coop behind the cabin. She bundled them, squawking and protesting, into burlap sacks, 2 to a bag, and made 3 more trips up the dark path. Their frantic fluttering felt like a panicked heartbeat against her back. By the time the first hint of grey light touched the eastern peaks, the cabin was nearly empty. It looked hollowed out, a shell from which the life had been carefully extracted. Adeline stood in the doorway for a final moment, the geology hammer heavy at her side. She looked at the empty pantry shelves, the bare pegs on the wall, the cold hearth. She was 25 years old. She had buried a husband and was about to bury herself. She closed the door without making a sound and walked up the mountain, not once looking back. She did not see Martha watching from her window, her face a mask of shame and fear. Adeline had her own world to build. The entrance to the hollow mine was a dark mouth waiting to swallow her whole. She slipped inside, pulling a screen of dead branches and brush over the opening, and disappeared from the world of men. The first order of business inside the mountain was security. The hollow mine was not a simple tunnel but a network of small, branching chambers, abandoned by prospectors a decade earlier. The air was still and cold, thick with the smell of damp earth and stone. Adeline's first task was to build a proper door, one that would be invisible from the outside. Using the timber she'd salvaged from her own barn in the nights leading up to her departure, she constructed a heavy frame just inside the entrance. Then, using a mixture of mud, gravel, and smaller rocks, she began to build a false wall against it, a careful masonry of camouflage. She left a single, heavy section of timber unmortared, fitted so tightly it was nearly invisible. This was her door, a plug of rock and wood that took all her strength to pivot open and closed. It was slow, brutal work. Her hands, already calloused, became raw and blistered. Every stone had to be lifted, tested for fit, and set in place. Every bucket of mud had to be mixed with water she hauled from the entrance in a pail. But with each stone she set, she felt a layer of fear fall away, replaced by the solid, satisfying weight of her own labor. She was walling herself in, but she was also walling the world out. The finality of it was both terrifying and liberating. Once the door was complete, she could work by lantern light without fear of being seen. The first chamber became her home. She carved a small alcove into one wall for her bedroll and quilts, another for her meager pantry. She built a small stone hearth against a wall that led to a narrow, winding fissure in the rock, a natural chimney that drew the smoke sluggishly upwards. It wasn't perfect, but it was enough. The fire was for cooking and warmth, a small, flickering sun in the heart of the permanent darkness. Next came the search for 3 essential elements: a steady source of air, a reliable supply of light, and a clean flow of water. Thomas had spoken of the mountain's breathing, the way fissures and vents connected the deep places to the surface. His old maps, which she had committed to memory, noted a geological fault line running through this part of the mountain. Following his remembered guidance, Adeline began to explore deeper into the mine. With the geology hammer in hand, she tapped the walls, listening not just with her ears but with the palm of her hand, feeling for the subtle vibrations that signaled thinner rock. She found the first vent in a high, narrow chamber, a place where the ceiling rose into a dark chimney. By building a precarious scaffold of rock, she was able to climb high enough to feel a faint, steady draft of cold air. She spent 3 days carefully widening the opening with a chisel and her hammer, not enough to create a large hole, but enough to improve the circulation of air throughout her chambers. Light was a more complex problem. She found a wide seam of mica schist, a rock that glittered with millions of tiny, reflective flakes. The vein was 20 feet tall and ran the length of a large cavern. For weeks, she labored to pry large, flat sheets of it from the wall. It was delicate work. Too much force and the sheets would shatter. Using wedges and patient, repeated taps of her hammer, she managed to free several slabs, each the size of a tabletop. She then hauled these heavy, glittering sheets to the chamber where she planned to build her garden. She angled them against the walls, creating a mosaic of dull mirrors. Her plan was to bounce and amplify whatever faint light she could coax from the surface down into the earth. It was a desperate hope, a gamble on the physics of reflection and the memory of her husband's lessons. The search for water was a matter of life and death. The small cask she had brought with her would not last long. She knew from Thomas that water often followed the same fault lines as the mineral veins. She began to explore the lowest levels of the mine, places where the air grew heavy and damp. She followed a dark seam of basalt that wept moisture, a line of glistening dampness on the rock. For days, she followed it deeper into the mountain's gut. The tunnel narrowed until she was forced to crawl, the lantern held out in front of her, the hammer scraping against the rock beside her. The sound of dripping grew louder, a slow, steady metronome in the absolute silence. Finally, the tunnel opened into a small grotto. In its center, a pool of water, clear and impossibly cold, was fed by a steady trickle from a fissure in the ceiling. It was a sacred sight. She knelt and drank, the water so cold it made her teeth ache. It was the mountain's own blood, pure and untainted. But the pool was too deep in the earth to be practical for a farm. She would have to bring the water to her garden. She returned to the main chambers and began another monumental task, carving a channel. She used the sharp end of the hammer and her strongest chisel to etch a shallow groove in the stone floor of the mine, a tiny aqueduct that would use gravity to guide the water. It was the most arduous work yet. For every foot of channel, she had to strike the stone 100 times. The ringing of steel on rock became the rhythm of her days. It was a sound no one on the surface could hear. It was the sound of a woman carving a new world out of the bones of the old one, drop by patient drop. With air, light, and water secured, Adeline could finally begin to build her farm. She had chosen the largest cavern, a space nearly 50 feet long and half as wide, with a high, vaulted ceiling. The floor was solid rock. To grow anything, she would need to create soil where none existed. This was the great labor, the task that would occupy her for the entire winter. Every second night, when the moon was new and the darkness was absolute, she would pivot open her hidden door and slip out into the world. She carried 2 large leather buckets and a spade. She walked 2 miles to a hidden basin by Pinion Creek where centuries of floods had deposited a deep, rich layer of alluvial soil. The earth was black and heavy and smelled of life. She would dig until her buckets were full, then begin the slow, arduous journey back up the mountain, her shoulders burning, her legs trembling with the strain. Back inside the cavern, she would dump the precious soil onto the rock floor, spreading it carefully. It was a pitifully small amount each time, a thin dusting on the stone. But she returned again and again, a silent phantom moving between the dark mountain and the dark earth. By the time the deepest snows of winter sealed the valley, she had created a plot of earth a foot deep and 20 feet square. It did not look like much, a patch of black against the grey stone, but to her it was everything. She mixed in the manure from her goats and the guano she collected from a bat colony in a deeper cave, creating a rich, potent soil. While the world above was frozen and sleeping, Adeline prepared her hidden field. She was a creature of the darkness now, her schedule dictated by the moon and the slow, patient work of creation. Her skin grew pale, but her arms and back became hard as ironwood. The mountain was remaking her, stripping away everything but the essential, stubborn core of her will to survive. In the faint, reflected light of her mica mirrors, she planted her first crops. She pressed the potato eyes deep into the dark soil, followed by the seeds of carrots and beets. These were root vegetables, patient plants that did not require the full, direct sun. In another section, she planted kale and chard, hardy greens that could tolerate the cool, dim conditions. Planting the seeds was an act of profound and desperate faith. She had no way of knowing if the faint, silvery light would be enough. She could only prepare the soil, provide the water, and wait. She tended to her small flock of animals, her only companions in the deep silence. The goats, Hester and Pearl, proved to be remarkably adaptable. They ate the tough, scrubby lichen she scraped from the rocks and drank from the stone channel she had carved. Their milk was a daily miracle, providing her with sustenance and a reason to keep a schedule. The chickens were less certain. They huddled together for warmth and produced few eggs in the perpetual twilight. But they survived. They scratched in the dirt floor of their stone pen and made soft, clucking sounds that were a comfort in the immense quiet. Adeline talked to them, her voice rough from disuse. She told them stories of the sun and the sky, descriptions of a world they had lost and she had willingly abandoned. Her days fell into a simple, monastic rhythm: tend the animals, carry water, check the soil, chip away at her endless projects of improvement. There was no day or night, only the cycle of tasks. Time seemed to stretch and dissolve. She was no longer living by the sun, but by the slow, geological time of the mountain itself. It was a lonely existence, but it was not a desperate one. It was a life built with her own two hands, beholden to no one, hidden from the eyes of a world that had cast her out. One day, deep in the spring, she was clearing a new air shaft near the summit when she saw him. He was an old man, his back bent like a question mark, leading a mule laden with prospecting gear. He moved with the slow, deliberate pace of someone who had spent a lifetime walking on uneven ground. He stopped 100 yards from her concealed position and began to set up a small camp. Fear, a feeling she had almost forgotten, seized her. She remained perfectly still, hidden behind a jumble of rocks, for hours. She watched him build a small, smokeless fire and cook a simple meal. He did not seem to be searching for anything. He seemed to be simply existing. His name, she would learn, was Phineas Croft. He was a prospector, one of the last of a breed of men who sought solitude as much as they sought gold. For 3 days, she watched him. He never ventured closer to her hidden entrance. On the 4th day, Adeline took a risk. She left a small pail of goat's milk and a half-dozen eggs on a flat rock along the path he took to a nearby spring. She watched from her hiding place as he found it. He stopped, looked around, his sharp eyes scanning the silent landscape. He picked up the pail, examined the eggs, and then looked directly toward her hiding place. He did not call out. He simply nodded, a small, quiet acknowledgement. He took the offering and left, in its place, a string of smoked, dried venison. An unspoken pact was made. A trade route was established between two hermits, a commerce of ghosts on a lonely mountain. They rarely spoke. When they did, the words were few and essential. Cold winter coming, he might say, looking at the sky. The mountain provides, she would reply. He never asked where she lived. He never asked why she was there. He saw the strength in her hands and the quiet resolve in her eyes, and for a man like Phineas, that was introduction enough. He was her only link to the human world, a link forged in silence and mutual respect, a quiet alliance on the fringes of the map. The farm took root. The potatoes sprouted, their pale green shoots pushing up through the black soil like determined fingers. The carrots grew, their feathered tops a splash of vibrant green in the gloom. The reflected light of the mica walls, combined with the nutrient-rich soil, was just enough. It was a strange, subterranean garden, a place of muted colors and profound silence, but it was alive. Adeline expanded her operation. She discovered a vast cavern deeper in the system, a chamber the size of a cathedral, and decided to risk bringing in a cow. Through Phineas, she traded a small amount of gold dust she had panned from an underground stream for a young, hardy Dexter cow, a breed known for its resilience. Getting the cow into the mountain was the greatest challenge she had yet faced. She had to temporarily dismantle her hidden door and widen the entrance, a week of dangerous, back-breaking labor done under the cover of storms. She led the animal inside at the peak of a thunderstorm, the noise covering the sounds of her work. The cow, bewildered at first, soon settled into her new, strange home, a stone pasture where the sun never shone. Adeline grew fodder for her in the form of fast-growing turnips and beets. The cow gave her milk, rich and creamy, and the promise of a calf. Her hidden world was becoming self-sustaining. She had created a complete ecosystem, a pocket of impossible life sealed within a tomb of rock. But as her world grew, so did the one outside. The blasting from the valley below grew louder, more frequent. Vance's syndicate was at work, scarring the land in their quest to tame it. The percussion sent tremors through the mountain, shaking dust from the cavern ceilings. Each blast was a reminder that her sanctuary was fragile, that the world she had escaped was still clawing at her stone walls. The dread was a constant, low hum beneath the surface of her daily chores. She was safe, but she was not free. The ordeal came in the second winter. It was a brutal season of deep snow and relentless cold. One night, a deep, groaning shudder ran through the mountain, far more powerful than the usual blasting. It was the sound of the earth shifting under the immense weight of the snow and ice. The next morning, the light in her garden cavern was terrifyingly dim. The main air shaft, the one that fed her mica mirrors, had collapsed somewhere near the surface. A trickle of air still came through, but the precious light was gone. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced the calm she had cultivated for 2 years. Without light, her plants would wither. The fodder for the cow would fail. The entire, delicate system she had built would starve and die. Her world was suffocating. She had no choice but to go to the surface and try to clear the blockage. It was a terrible risk. The Syndicate surveyors had been working in that area. But the risk of staying was greater. She put on her heaviest coat, took her shovel and her hammer, and prepared to emerge into the blinding world of snow. The climb up the fissure from the inside was treacherous, a chimney of loose rock and ice. When she finally pushed aside the rock that covered the top, the brilliance of the sun on the snow was a physical blow. It was a world of white, silent and immense. She found the collapse easily, a great heap of snow and rock covering the depression that marked her shaft. She began to dig, her movements frantic. She was exposed, a dark figure in a vast white landscape. Every snap of a frozen branch, every gust of wind, sounded like approaching footsteps. The fear was a living thing, choking her, but she dug on. Her life was in this hole. As she cleared the last of the rock, she saw it. The collapse had exposed something new. Not just her vent, but a dark, glittering vein in the rock beside it. It was a seam of tellurium, the very mineral Thomas had told her was a sign of gold. He had searched for it for years. She had found it while trying to save her own life. At that same moment, a new sound reached her. Voices. Men, working their way up the slope. She had been seen.